Serious? People who have worked at psychiatric wards. Who was the most troubled patient you worked with? Young man who was suffering from drug-induced psychosis. He had smoked some spice and was taken to out hospital with involuntary status. He stayed for over a month with no signs of remission. He covered the entire spectrum of psychotic behaviors during his stay, but the worst was when he would pop into reality for a moment. The look of sheer terror in his face and the shaky voice have stuck with me. His family broke down during visitation and only his father could manage weekly visits afterwards. Chemically induced psychosis, from my experience, is game over most of the time. I've seen a few people recover to a degree but never fully. Don't frick with spice. In a day treatment facility I volunteered for, I led a writing group to help people develop goals and motivation to continue in treatment. One woman gave really strong and compelling answers about wanting to improve her health, to be a better wife and mother, have the energy to run around and play with her kids, etc. Several weeks after beginning the group, I mentioned this to another therapist, who informs me this woman has no husband or children, and never has. I worked in the dental clinic of a psychiatric hospital for a bit, and I'll never forget a patient named Terry. Terry loved to wear little girls' clothing and would have pictures of little girls that he had cut out of magazines on a string around his neck. When I first encountered him, I automatically made the assumption that he was some sort of pedophile. I later learned from the dentist I had worked with that Terry had witnessed his little sister being brutally raped and murdered by their stepfather when they were children. He had in a way started to assume the identity of his little sister, and he considered the girls in the pictures he cut out his friends. I felt horrible for jumping to conclusions, especially after I got to know him more and saw what a gentle, kind soul he was. On the other hand, you were in a place where his story was known and you could adjust accordingly. Imagine how the outside world must have treated him. I worked on a juvenile psych unit. I had to put a girl in restraints that included her head because she was so suicidal and distraught that she was biting chunks out of her own shoulder. Maybe 3 years later I took a bus to interview for a graduate psych program. When I switched buses, a nicely dressed girl asked me if I was from Colorado. I said yes. Then she asked me if I worked on a psych unit. It was her, all better. We chatted for a while and I told her how happy I was to see her doing so well. She smiled, thanked me, and we said our goodbyes. Had a dementia patient, among other things I imagine, but I was just the nursing assistant. I don't get much for patient histories, just whether they can walk unassisted or poo on their own. She was a very kind, sweet old lady. She thought of herself as a young mother, so she carried a doll with her, wrapped in a blanket. She was even allowed a baby bed, and every night she would tuck her baby in beside her bed. Then she would talk about the baby growing inside her belly. She would go on very coherently about her pregnancy and her child. She had me believing she lived in this sweet fantasy land that was set on repeat, but it would all abruptly end and start over once her baby was due and there was no new baby. She would mope for about a month, super depressed, not eating, non-stop crying. She could not be consoled. She'd get fairly violent, then it would start over. She'd just wake up one morning and as happy as could be. Did you hear the great news? I'm going to have another baby. One night she got all tucked in and forgot to tuck her baby in. I noticed and said, I can tuck Susan in for the night, and reached in to get her baby. The woman throat punched me hard. I dropped the baby doll when I fell over gasping for air. She then started to lose it as she was trying to further assault me, yelling at me about driving too fast and destroying everything she loved. Once the dust settled, it was shared with me that she was pregnant once upon a time, and she already had a 1-year-old. The husband and the 1-year-old got in an accident on the way to the hospital. They both died. She was so distraught over it she gave the newborn up for adoption. That's why her delusions start over after the due date, and she is so mad in between. I imagine some residual guilt, anger for her loss is what caused her to throat punch me for taking her doll. When I first started working there, I just thought she was some fun old delusional lady. I never expected the delusions to have backstories. It's heartbreaking. Dementia seems horrifying enough when it's described as being confused or losing your mind, but it seems so much worse when it's repeat your worst life experience over and over until you die. To constantly be stuck in the time leading up to your most traumatic experience and reliving it over and over. The very definition of heck, in my opinion. This is incredibly heart-wrenchingly sad. To me, the idea of heck is to repeat your worst life experience over and over, like you said there. This poor woman. Kid that was completely dissociative. Would randomly just start screaming, asking his mother to stop hitting him. He was pretty low functioning, so it was really hard to process. He would look at me and tell me how she beat him with chains and belts. The doctor believed that the young man felt like he was in safe environment for the first time in his life, and his mind was allowing him to remember past trauma. Full-on flashbacks that seem real and current to the person experiencing them are part of CPTSD. Poor kid. Not specifically at a psychiatric ward, but had a patient at the hospital with severe dementia. I had gotten her up and out of the bed to the bedside commode, bedside toilet, and while trying to get her back in bed, she demanded I get my hands off of her. She took a step back away from me, ripped off her gown and was completely naked, grabbed the commode and started attempting to swing it at me while accusing me of making racial slurs towards her. I had to end up calling the charge nurse, who proceeded to call security. Well, about a minute later, security comes running in the room and busts out laughing as he sees a butt-naked little old lady trying to corner me while swinging a commode at me. Dementia is a horrible thing. My nan has it, and in a matter of days, she went from a normal, albeit very highly strung and slightly paranoid old woman, to one who insisted on sliding around the hospital ward on her ass and claiming she was a dog. I was in a juvenile psych unit. A 16-year-old kid was in for molesting his 3-year-old sister. He was court ordered to be there for a period of time. I found out that he was raped by his father. I asked him where he would be going after release, because he couldn't go back into his home with his sister. He told me his father had found a camper and put it at a lake, and he would be living there until he graduated. Yes, the same father that raped him. His head was so fricked. I had a kid once that kept freaking out during the night shift. He was from South America and kept babbling in Spanish about demons coming to get him, and I barely understand Spanish, so there wasn't much I could do to calm him down. He abruptly stopped screaming and went dead silent with huge eyes, looking directly at something behind me. I turned around and there was nothing there, but he kept staring anyway. I didn't get much sleep after that shift. I have spent time inside a few different psychiatric facilities. I met a lot of interesting folks. Many years ago there was a lady with horrific burned scars from her head down her entire body. She was chronically depressed. She was very badly disfigured. She was just the sweetest person ever. Always a kind word for anyone and happy to listen. I bugged one of the nurses to tell me why she was covered in burns. I was told she set herself on fire after losing her baby. I worked in a psych hospital for a couple months between undergrad and grad school. We were a short-term facility that mostly took crisis clients. However, we had some people who were there for months while waiting for a bed at the state hospital an hour away. There are two patients which I think about on a semi-regular basis. One was a long-term client. He was diagnosed with severe, treatment-refractory schizophrenia. He had been diagnosed with early onset schizophrenia in his teenage years 60s when I knew him, and had been in and out of psychiatric hospitals his whole life. His formal thought disorder was so bad that his speech was almost unintelligible, and he had a guardian ad litem to make decisions for him. When I started, he had already been there about 2 months and everyone knew him. He was nice enough, and pretty much all he wanted in the world was a cigarette, which he couldn't have. He caused issues now and then. Slapped a female patient with his hard dong once, and so I started getting put on one-to-ones with him. We started to get to know each other and he learned to like me a little. He got really frustrated one and punched me in the back of the head. The next day he came up to me, said, "Sorry, Juba," what he called me, and gave me a hug. He left for the state hospital the day before my last day. The other was a short-term client at the very end of my time there. He was a young guy who had tested positive for HIV and started experiencing suicidal thoughts as a result. He cried the entire time he was there. He wouldn't talk much and wasn't eating. Though not as harrowing as most of the comments here, when I was doing psych clerkship as a med student, there was a schizophrenic patient with the usual signs: auditory hallucinations, disheveled appearance, no expression on his face. He admitted to voices talking to him. The resident I was shadowing asked him what the voices say to him, and he refused to answer that question. Then she informed him that they can give him some medications to make the voices go away, and he immediately rebuked that option. Mind you, still displaying no expression on his face the whole time. When the resident asked him why, he replied, "They are my only friends." That hit hard. They say the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. I'm a nurse, but I'm also being treated for a mental disorder. It's quite frightening to know that who you are emotionally and mentally can change significantly with a medication. Sometimes it's scarier than the agony you're used to. It's not the answer you're looking for, since I imagine you're expecting something like a schizophrenic being hilariously insane running around pretending they're a bird or some such, but brain damage. Brain damage can be absolutely horrific. Broken humans that don't work anymore and nobody knows what to do with them. There was one guy who had brain damage from infant meningitis. The guy's about 40-50 years old now, but he's exactly like what you might imagine a lobotomized person to look like. Totally vacant staring eyes, jaw hanging down with a continuous thread of dribble rolling off his bottom lip, arms hanging down by his sides, and all he does is pace up and down whatever room his is in, all day and all night, until he collapses asleep after about 4-5 days sleep 12 hours, wakes up and resumes pacing. He wears an adult nappy diaper because he is totally incontinent, and changing it is remarkably difficult because he won't stop pacing even while people are trying to clean him up. He cannot eat by himself. He cannot do anything by himself. The only verbal noise speech he produces is a loud gu 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 like a propeller engine starting up. There's nothing there in his mind at all. He's a husk. He never smiles, never frowns, give no indication of any aspiration or want. That has been his entire life. He has no purpose, has required 24-hour care his entire life. And I don't think there's a single person who has ever worked with him that wouldn't have gladly taken him outside and shot him in the head if they were allowed to. Anybody opposed to euthanasia hasn't seen real brain damage. Anyone who can't understand why doctors give up trying to resuscitate after a certain point where irreversible brain damage has occurred have not seen real brain damage. Anyone upset about the doctors ending Charlie Gard's life haven't seen real brain damage. They should transport the guy I described between hospitals to show family members what the doctors are talking about when they say that a person should be allowed to die. I've worked at a psych unit for teens children for a couple years. I think the scariest for me personally was a 5-year-old we had. He was well behaved and actually really cute. At home, he had beat up the family cat to the point of its bones breaking because he liked the sounds the cat made. He had raped a younger sister with some of his toys. He is the youngest I've ever encountered with sociopathic tendencies. I worked for a psych nurse and interviewed her for a uni assignment on this very question. She said she had a lady who killed a man who looked like her sister's molester. Wasn't him, was an all-round awful situation, but was the sweetest, most motherly, caring older woman. Another guy who kept a 9-year-old for some period of time, like abducted him. She had been a nurse on 2 electroshock sessions and said one woman was deadly bedridden, depressed in what sounded like an extreme breakdown kind of way and had it, and the next day turned 180 from it. For her it was super effective. Had a runaway that ended in a big manhunt. Never a dull moment. She did however refuse to work in the critical, might be the wrong word, ward. She said it was too hard, which I took to mean too depressing. Worked in a forensic mental health facility for almost 2 years, and needless to say there were a lot of people that I'd put on the troubled end of the spectrum. However, the one that was the most troubled easily was the guy we had in a vault 24/7. Like literally, his room door was a vault door, a protected camera high up on the ceiling in the corner of the room. He was 6'5" and easily 300 lbs. Allowed a dedicated psychiatric aide keep an eye on him for their whole shift. Yes. This one person's job for 12 hours was to watch him. This guy was allowed outside for 5 minutes a day, though he was rarely stable enough to allow for it. When they did take him outside, he was chained up with a mask and shackles and cuffs straight up Hannibal Lecter style and escorted by 6 people. They'd do a little circle around a walled-in courtyard and take him back. In the time I was there I never saw him freak out. Apparently he had calmed down quite a bit thanks to -33 ACT sessions and an insane dosage of meds they injected into him regularly. That being said, his normal state was nothing to envy. He'd spend his days eating his own crap. fisting himself, drawing art with vomit, eating his own vomit, jerking off and wiping the results across the window whenever a female nurse or aide walked past his tiny peephole of a window, and laughing talking to himself at the wall. I never found out what he did to end up in the facility in the first place. A lot of our residents had done their crimes before the 90s, so not a lot of their info was readily available online. One of the guys who had worked there since the early 80s told me he never remembered why the guy was initially brought it, but that he had been moved to the high security room after raping a few other residents and assaulting some staff with a weapon. This might be the most horrifying story yet. Just know. Someone's job was to watch this guy 2 girls 1 cup himself for 12 hours a day. Without too much detail, probably the man who had killed his child by burying him in a sandpit whilst that child was alive. That was many years before I knew him, and he had settled down completely by the time I cared for him. Roughly happened at least 60 years before I started. It was challenging at first, because he was schizophrenic, but had committed the crime before being diagnosed properly. I felt a lot of sympathy, and he was the walking personification of regret if ever I've seen it. You could talk to him normally, but he'd always have the 1,000-yard stare. I came away from the mental health hospital with a great deal of empathy for the patients, and this was geriatric care, so they had to live with some horrible crap all their lives. I'd also do my best to keep a relative from a mental health hospital, if at all possible. One time had a Navy SEAL on the unit just diagnosed as psychotic. He decided to leave and we watched him kick his way through a locked metal door, something that we thought was physically impossible. He kicked and kicked until it bent enough to pull the latches free. As it was an involuntary court-ordered hospitalization, we were supposed to stop him, but when we saw what he was doing to the door, we decided maybe we would just let him go, as if we could have stopped him. Called the police and let them deal with it. Heard later he was found limping. Door took a toll. Down the street in just his underwear rambling about the enemy. Word was it took about 10 cops to subdue him using all their non-lethal weapons. Whoa. I'm a psychiatry resident on an inpatient adolescent unit right now. I had a 15-year-old girl who came from a home of domestic violence and drugs. Her and her 3 younger siblings was taken out by CPS when she was 6 years old, into foster care and was eventually adopted. She described a narrative where her adopted parents only adopted her because they didn't want to split up the siblings. She said that since she had been adopted, she had been emotionally abused, calling her names, condescending, over the last few years. She's been through a bunch of different relationships with older men, 30s. So when CPS found out she was sleeping with all these older guys, there was an investigation opened, and the adopted parents essentially shamed the patient from the home for putting them through that and filed a failed adoption, giving up their guardianship and rights to their adoption. We have family therapy sessions with all adolescents that come on the unit, and when I got on the phone with her parents and the patient, they essentially said, "You're toxic to our family and we no longer want you a part of it." Very aggressive and bitter, and so that essentially terminated their relationship. So every morning after, she was in tears asking me why her parents or adopted parents never loved her. She told me the reason she sought out relationships from older men was because she didn't know what love was and felt like they could teach her how to love. Despite her not returning back to her adopted home, she kept asking me what she could do to make things between them better. It was just heartbreaking. Oh my god. I don't understand how the adoptive parents could do that. It isn't like they married and now they want a divorce because this is a toxic relationship and I don't want you in my life anymore. That's a child, goddammit it, and now they have no one. I currently work in a state hospital and my primary unit is a forensics unit, so I see many patients that have charges. The one patient that I would say was troubled was a man in his mid-30s we had a few months back. I don't remember what his charges were, to be honest, but it was rather minor. Probably criminal trespass or a minor assault charge, but he would sleep in the lobby most nights and if he woke up at all he'd sit there and cry for hours. We were told to ignore it as he did it all the time, which rubbed me the wrong way. Finally one morning I was on an overtime shift and he had woken up and having a good day till just after med-pass when he started crying loudly and for no apparent reason. I decided to go sit and talk with him. Turns out he was depressed. Something not on his diagnosis, because he was afraid of what comes next. No one had told him that there is halfway homes or programs to help patients get back to a normal life after they either got their charges dropped, which his was a few days later, or after they served their time in jail. He thanked me profusely and made rapid improvement in his depression after that. Last I heard from the caseworkers, he was placed in a halfway house with a good work program and was making good headway. I worked as an RN in an inpatient psych unit. We admitted any age, youngest was 2, and would have some violent individuals with minimal staffing. My worst was a 4-year-old with extensive physical and sexual abuse. Social services found her tied to a tree. She did not meet any typical milestones and would grunt to communicate. I left 3 times during the admission process to choke back tears. It was the beginning of the end for my career working in psych. I had the thickest skin and could tolerate the toughest of situations. I couldn't take how an individual could corrupt something so innocent. I worked with a child, started when she was 10, who was the result of a schizophrenic male and a mentally retarded female. The girl had fetal alcohol syndrome, autism, and had scars from being burned with cigarettes. I also worked with a child who was in a religious cult and had been kept in a cage. He was 6 and had no idea how to function. 11-year-old girl came in with the police. Her brother changed the TV channel. She was eating her dinner and stabbed him 4 times in the arm, then jumped from the first story. 9 security officers and 2 police officers to restrain her. She was chewing her gums and spitting blood at me doing an assessment. PLN decided it was behavioral after 5 minutes and sent her back to juvenile prison. Was a nursing student at the time, and I have been a nurse for years now, and this is still by far the most troubled patient I have worked with. I was going through my weekly rotation in the SIL ward when my instructor assigned me one of the few males that were admitted. I am a male, so I often got the male patients. Turned out that this is still, to this day I believe, the only SI patient that have ever been flown into our facility. He would mutilate himself for sexual pleasure. Of course, it wasn't the cutting his arm or legs kind of mutilation. He would have to mutilate his genitals for sexual pleasure. The kicker is, this isn't the first time he has been hospitalized for this. He lost one testicle in the 90s, attempted to cut off the other about 10 years ago, and this time he tried taking the whole thing off. When I asked him why he did it all, he gave me the most sane and logical responses. He said he knows it is wrong. He knows he might be one of the only people in the world that has this issue, and he realizes that taking away his genitals prevents him from forming lasting relationships. He said that since he is so isolated and there is no other way for him to get sexual gratification, he has to mutilate himself. I honestly felt horrible for him because he said he has been struggling with this since he was a kid. As far as I could tell, he was 100% normal except for the whole mutilation thing. Had a guy nice and intelligent. He did the same thing, he would cut anything though. He managed to get a hold of a plastic knife, picked a fight with an easy target and went into seclusion. He severed 3/4 of his penis and sat against the door so couldn't open it easily in a matter of 15 minutes between checks. The blood was horrific and his eerie smile. I worked at a medium secure forensic mental health hospital. Male 1864. Criminal convictions. A gentleman who, when I first began working there, seemed like a lovely guy, though at times quick to anger and delusional. He had bipolar disorder and I believe I met him in a hypomanic manic state. We had 2 rehab wards, lowest risk, 2 continuing care wards, medium risk, where I worked mostly, 1 acute ward, high, with a sub-intensive care ward, V high, and single seclusion room. For emergencies only and requiring substantial medical and legal paperwork reviewed every 24 hours. Any patient spending excessive time in the room would have to go to a high secure hospital. This patient had crushing lows and was soon moved from my ward to the intensive care ward. His suicide risk was such that he required one direct observation 24/7. He was still allowed to shave with a safety razor and of course under direct obs. Potentially dangerous objects were in a security room and counted in and out, etc. The issue that arose is that the razor is counted out simply as razor and then returned. This patient had somehow, under one obs, managed to remove a blade from the razor, like a Mach 3 or whatever that has whatever number of blades, and hide it. It was simply counted back and razor returned. An undetermined amount of time later, he suddenly slammed the door of his room. Staff would sit in front of the open door watching and barricade it, then hack away at his own throat. The blood was unimaginable, and his continuing to fight off and scream and keep hacking away as staff got in. I couldn't imagine such crushing, desperate depression. Oh, and another strange one who basically lived in the seclusion room. He bent his fingers so far back they touched the back of his hand and caused the skin on the inside of the joints to tear. Following this, he would continually rip out the stitches and rub feces into the wound whenever possible. He soon returned to Broadmoor. Risk within the hospital classification. All patients were deemed medium risk to society, hence the medium secure hospital placement. This was just an informal subcategory, if that makes sense. I spent some time in wards. I think the worst was when I was 14. A 3 or 4 year old girl was brought in. She wouldn't stop crying and trying to pull her hair out, so the staff put her in the quiet room and then spent ages yelling at her to stop crying and stop pulling her hair out, and yelled at her for wetting herself. I couldn't sleep, so I offered to try to calm her down and they let me. I let her sit on my lap, and after that she started calming down and went to sleep. She wasn't really the most troubled, but her age made the situation the most upsetting. I think she was just really scared. I left her in the quiet room with staff. I don't know if they put her in bed or what. They let me take a shower and let me sleep in. She was only there because DHS had to pull her out of her home in the middle of the night and didn't have any place to take her. She was picked up before I got up the next morning to be taken to a foster home. I guess the most troubled person was a lady with psychosis. She was walking around spitting on the floor so that her spit could poison the nurses. She told me to be careful so I didn't get poisoned too. That was the only relatively coherent thing I heard her say. I actually have more horror stories about the staff than I do the other patients. Most of the patients were just kind of sad and needed help. Disclaimer: not me, but a co-worker's wife. She works as a therapist at a psychiatric facility in the middle of nowhere. She had a patient transferred to her after he became too attached to his previous worker. The guy had schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and a long history of violence. Before he was ever admitted, he lived with his mother and sister. His sister had Down syndrome and his mother was their caregiver. One day he decided to rape his sister and his mother, then nearly beat his mother to death. That incident was 3 years ago, and now she is working alongside him, often taking walks with him alone around the edge of the compound. Needless to say, my co-worker gets real anxious about her working there. I worked as a shopkeeper in a mental community. The idea is that psychiatric patients that either could not or would not be rehabilitated into society would spend their time here. There was this one patient called Mark. Mark was 78. He has spent his entire life in institutions since he was 24-ish. He was a millionaire and I had their shop balances to prove it. He was driven to insanity after coming into a large amount of money, and he was paranoid about keeping it his. No longer a threat to anyone or himself, he was to spend his days at the community, mainly because he had no idea how the outside world worked and no family or friends to entrust his care. Come one Christmas he came to my shop and said, "I am embarrassed, Mr. Yarl, because I never learned to write properly and I really want to send Christmas cards to my friends. Would you help me out?" Being no calligraphist, I reluctantly agreed and spent the good part of 2 hours with him writing cards to the staff and his friends around the community. Finally, there was one card left. He said, "I want you to write this one to you." I respectfully declined. I didn't need the card and I believe they are waste of money trees. No, I insist. You have done so much for me. Okay, well, I knew from my training not to agitate the patients. If I could accept a request, I would do it. So I wrote out the card, stuck it in its envelope and handed it back to Mark. He looked at me, handed me the card with a wry grin and said, "You just wrote a Christmas card to yourself. You should be in here, not me." He promptly skipped off with all his cards. TLDR. It was me. I was the most troubled patient I'd worked with. The ending to that honestly made me laugh. Like, for the most part that was rather sad, but the ending, it just made me think of the "you played yourself" meme. I worked for a number of years a residential facility, ages 6-106, and have seen it all. Most clients were diagnosed autism, so you saw the typical self-injury and harmful to others. Most older clients had a mild to moderate disability that today you would just accept as slow, but since they had been there for so long, the facility was their home and they didn't want to go elsewhere. It's also really nice, I might add, but I saw some crap. 1. Had a client shove a metal jagged end of a broomstick that he snapped in half right into his abdomen, then start screaming and digging into it with his fingers. 2. Had a child, maybe 80 years, who could have modeled on the front of a Gap catalog. He could be the nicest, quietest kid, or he could try and cut you with whatever was nearby and tell you that he was there because he cut his family's dog's paws off. It was in his file, and that was not the only animal. 3. Another kid completed his whole program and set to go home. We were all thrilled. He came back the following week because he stripped naked in school and threw a desk at his classmate. 4. Another child, maybe 6, severely burned by a family member with a blowtorch. 5. Had a teenage client commit suicide in a horrific manner. 6. Had an adult client go outside with a bat and smash a co-worker's new BMW. I was actually thrilled to see that happen. Maybe the most troubled were some of the staff, rather than the clients. You had staff who had been there for decades and truly cared about the clients. Then, you had new hires that wouldn't last more than a year. And although I never saw anything physically abusive, I definitely had to report staff being verbally abusive to clients. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.